So please help me welcome to the podium, to the table, to the dais, Mr. Frededrick Glaysher. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yolanda. Pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the honor of being able to speak about Robert Hayden here at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. Thank everyone for coming today, and those tuning in on the internet to hear a little bit about Hayden and his poetry. Robert Hayden was born in 1913, grew up in Detroit's Paradise Valley, studied at Detroit City College, now Wayne State University, wrote theater reviews for the Michigan Chronicle, and radio plays for a station in Windsor, which many people often don't realize or have heard of. For the Federal Writers Project Administration, he wrote during the Great Depression years from 1936 to 1940 a monograph entitled History of the Negro in Michigan, and eventually studied at the University of Michigan in the early 1940s, first as a part-time student and then full-time, earning a master's degree in English, studying with the English poet W.H. Auden, and staying on for a few years as a teaching assistant at the University of Michigan. He then taught at Fisk University for more than 2 decades before returning to teach at the University of Michigan in 1976. In 1966, Hayden received the grand prize for poetry at the first World Festival of Negro Arts in Senegal, Africa, attended by more than 10,000 people, a who's who of African and African American literature, and which was personally presented to Hayden in New York City thereafter by President and poet Leopold Sédar Senghor. Quite an honor in itself. Among other awards and recognition, Hayden was appointed the consultant in poetry, now known as the Poet Laureate, to the Library of Congress from 1976 to 1978. There have been 4 books written on Hayden's life and poetry, at least now several dissertations, and probably now approximately 80 to 100 articles and reviews or chapters in various books. There have been at least 2 conferences held in his honor at the University of Michigan, one in the early 1990s, and recently in 2013 to mark the centennial of his birth. Much of the discussion often revolves around issues of his being an African-American man, his private life, and struggles to be a poet. Many of the articles focus on a poem or 2 that are among his masterpieces and which readers have responded to deeply, such as Middle Passage and Those Winter Sundays, the latter of which, Those Winter Sundays, has become one of the most anthologized poems in all of American history. And that's covering an awful lot of time and centuries here in American literature. Emphasizing the continuing influence of Robert Hayden, Philip M. Richards, Professor Emeritus of Colgate University, educated at Yale University and the University of Chicago, writes in his 2006 book, Blackheart, The Moral Life of Recent African-American Letters, in, quote, in the long run, in the long view of African-American poetry, Hayden's symbolist poetry has proved more influential than the Black Arts movement. Hayden, years after his death, remains our most influential black poet, and his followers the most productive and distinguished school of artists and intellectuals. Similarly, Charles Henry Roll, editor of the African-American journal Callaloo, in his book published in 2013, Angles of Ascent, a Norton anthology of contemporary African-American poetry, writes, quote, the title of this anthology pays tribute to Hayden, a master artist who left behind an extraordinary gift in the pantheon of North American poetry, end quote. For context, as it relates to Hayden, I need to touch briefly on some of my own personal biography. I was born in 1954 at the old Evangelical Deaconess Hospital on East Jefferson Avenue in Detroit. My family living at the time in the vicinity of Jefferson Chalmers, where many of my relatives had lived for generations, even back into the 1860s, all over the east side of Detroit. All that and more was always in my own consciousness of who I was as someone growing up in the Detroit area. About 1973, I moved back to Detroit, near 7 Mile and John R. One day at the Detroit Public Library, I noticed a poster that a librarian had put up about the poet Robert Hayden. I soon sought out his books and read and immersed myself in his poetry, in time deciding I would transfer to the University of Michigan to study with him, was my hope, all of which came more true than I had ever imagined, editing both his collected poems and his collected prose. Since 1983, I've written 4 essays on Hayden, 3 of which are published in my collections of essays, already mentioned, Introduction to the Growth of the EUMENIDES and the Myth of the Enlightenment, partly focusing on race, his personal struggles and religious views and so forth. I also spoke about Hayden last month at the Detroit Public Library for Poetry Month, talking specifically about his poems on space travel, of which he wrote a number somewhat late in life, subject that fascinated him. I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much this evening, but focus on the literary and aesthetic quality of his poetry and widen the perspective on his art and life. With the hindsight of 37 years since Hayden died in 1980, I think it can now be seen, as both Philip Richards and Charles Rowe suggested, that Hayden clearly wrote the most exquisite, influential body of poetry grappling with African American experience since the beginning of, quote, settlement upon these shores, unquote, to allude to a poem by Hayden, for settlement, of course, enslavement. A mere recitation of the names of the figures in his poems of African American lineage and history recounts the breadth of Hayden's concern and scope. Crispus Attucks, Revolutionary War hero, Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, Sojourner Truth, Martin Luther, Malcolm X, Phyllis Wheatley, John Brown, Bessie Smith, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, Paul Robeson, and many others. Many poems are dealing with African American culture and history without even having an identifiable figure or person as subject. His elegies for Paradise Valley, for instance, and other poems, are set in a mythic space that Hayden creates through the sheer power of his art. At the same time, probably about half of his poems aren't specifically about black experience or history. Smelt Fishing, The Peacock Room, and 4 Young Artists. Eskimos, Chinese, Jews, and others, he had a very wide and sympathetic heart that responded to life from Detroit to Veracruz, Mexico. To space aliens visiting our planet, trying to figure out what to make of all of us earthlings down here, what a mess we are. Hayden peered out from between the lines. Where did all this come from? All is well, as is well known, he grew up in what most people would consider and is usually described as a dysfunctional family. I'll leave aside retelling all of that. I would say that what's important in the end is what he made of it. Superlative art through which he sought and found healing and dramatized and recorded for others wisdom so deep and profound that it never stops giving once one begins to enter the world of his words and creation. Although I've been reading Hayden's poetry since the early 1970s, I'm still astonished at times to realize something I never thought of before, a new insight, allusion, or nuance. Only the greatest artists and poets are capable of doing that for a reader. Most poets are soon exhausted and just as soon forgotten. When they die, their words die with them. Hayden is clearly living on, and his poems will go forward with American literature into the centuries. Hayden's characters on the page are so alive that they still seem like someone we'd meet down the street or at the grocery store. His selection of a scene and the angle he creates or takes on it are so masterful that the slightest change would destroy the effect. Hayden's insight is so refined it never fails. Like Shakespeare, Hayden's characters are in the language itself, the language used to present them and with which they speak. For instance, he presents Belle, the classy dresser, in just the right way to evoke and humanize her character and flair. Troupe, the defeated artist, daubs in quarrelsome reds, disconsolate blues. Hayden's unparalleled use of the great Roman literary form known as ubi sunt, a rhetorical form asking, where are they, powerfully drives home our mortality with the refrain, let vanished rooms, let dead streets tell. We have to go back to at least the French poet Villon's medieval use of the form in the 1400s to find a poem that even begins to compare with Hayden's. Brilliant use of it. Surpassing even Villon's single stanza, Hayden's remembered dead are so abundant and press so intensely on his consciousness that he requires two stanzas to summon them to his purposes. Another way of looking at this poem is that Hayden is so fully in control of his facility as a master poet that he exults in his ability to evoke his imagined dead back to life in his poetry, and once is not enough. He just has to do it twice. He delights in his ability to call them forth from the abyss and make them live again. From Elegies for Paradise Valley, number 4, in the collected poems. And Belle, the classy dancer, where is she, who changed her frocks 3 times a day? Where's Nora with her laugh, her comic flair? Stage-struck Nora, waiting for her chance. Where's fast Iola, who so loved to dance she left her sickbed one last time to whirl in silver at the palace till she fell? Where's mad Miss Alice, who ate from garbage cans? Where's snuff-dipping Lucy, who played us tunes on her guitar? Where's Hattie? Where's Melissa Bell? Let vanished rooms, let dead streets tell. Where's Jim, Watusi Prince and good old boy, who with a joke went off to fight in France? Where's Tom, the defeated artist? The meals of booze, daubing with quarrelsome reds, disconsolate blues. Where's Les, the huntsman, tough cake chocolate, where's he? Where's Dapper Jess? Where's Stump, the shell-shock, clowning for us in parodies of war? Where's taunted Christopher, sad queen of night, and Ray, who cursing crossed the color line? Where's gentle brother Davis? Where's dope fiend Mel? Let vanished rooms, let dead streets tell. Incredible poem. Breathtakingly beautiful, evocative of how swiftly passing life is, and the memories Hayden had of those people of long ago in Paradise Valley. A requiem of sorts, in words, full of compassion and love, not mockery, cynicism, cruelty, or disdain, but humane feelings of the highest order that moves the reader, touching and inspiring the reader with the same feelings of love and humanity that Hayden had felt when he was writing the poem. As Tolstoy has said, the highest art does. Profoundly human, full of care and pathos at the nature of life we all experience, but only the greatest poet can find the perfect words to put it into. To lodge one poem with readers where it will be hard to get rid of it, as Robert Frost once said, is about all most poets can hope to achieve. But Hayden did it poem after poem after poem. The drama and stories Hayden tells are often just a slight sketch, seemingly slight, Yet the darkest Greek tragedy is laden behind it, as in Incense of the Lucky Virgin, about a single mother who kills 2 of her children, a third escaping. Incense of the Lucky Virgin. High John the Conqueror didn't bring him home again, didn't get his children fed, get his children fed. I prayed, and what did prayer avail? My candles held no power. And evening came, I prayed no more, and blew my candles out. Oh, blew my candles out. Put on your Sunday ribbon bows, Cleola, Willie Mae. You, Garland, go and shine your Sunday shoes. Make haste and shine your shoes. They were so happy they forgot they were hungry, daddyless. Except the old May, maybe, she wasn't asking, where are we going, Mommy, where are we going? Garland was too quick for me. He didn't yell once as he ran. Leola, Willie Mae won't be hungry anymore. Oh, they'll never cry hunger anymore. Tragedy rises beyond the mundane and domestic scene and the political to life itself in the poet's stance in the poem as he recounts it, in the seeming objectivity driving home the tragedy all the more. We go to the newspapers for reportage and commentary, to the courts and politicians for justice and new social policies and improvement, we hope. The poet goes to God with cries like Job of the Bible. I'm innocent. They're innocent. Demanding to know the meaning of it all, mourning the shattered and lost lives. The tragic depths of Hayden can be found throughout his poems. Tragedy, which shouldn't be confused with despair or giving up on life, has always been felt to be the highest form of literary art because it looks at life undeceived, knowing that all vanity and delusion end at the grave, reminding us of it. Again, our own mortality. So they who understand and experience literary tragedy shaken to one's existential foundation might think twice before the terrible act, whether Mr. or Mrs. Macbeth. Aristotle's catharsis and purgation, talking of tragedy, led to restraint, if not virtue. Not the same as Sunday morning sermonizing, but thought by great poets and often by Hayden to be the most worthwhile way to think about life. All of it subtly suggested by Hayden, communicating with the reader at the highest level of the art. Among the poets that Robert Hayden regarded as his own masters was the English poet Robert Browning, W.H. Auden already mentioned, and the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. He had studied Browning's poetry as a student at the University of Michigan and later taught Robert Browning at times at Fisk University, as his papers attest there. Robert Browning has always been recognized for his use of what's called a dramatic monologue, where a character is in some dramatic situation and speaking and acting out some situation. At some point in his own development as a poet, Hayden came to see the possibilities of Browning's dramatic monologue for his own poetry, using it in his poems many times. Yeats had created a modern Irish mythology in his own poetry out of the traditional Irish folk tales, stories, and legends from the Irish past. The example how Yeats mythologized all that in modern times for his own people, if you will, was always an example for Hayden. One he honored with a reproduction of the famous portrait of Yeats that he kept in his own study. And it was the only portrait of another writer that I ever saw in his study. I knew Hayden for the last year of his life, and I spent a lot of time with him, helping him with his manuscripts and various things during that last year, and had cause to be in his study for that reason. Auden for Hayden was a personal connection to the great English poets and an example of a life dedicated to poetry and the use of modern literary English that Hayden admired and strove to live up to. By Hayden's own account, studying with Auden at the University of Michigan helped him mature beyond his own earlier folk style of poetry in his first book of poems. Hayden was later to draw from his experience and knowledge of writing many brief encyclopedia-like sketches that he wrote for the Federal Writers Project from 1936 to 40, as I mentioned, for the history of the Negro in Michigan, among which in that work are pieces he wrote that he later wrote poems about the individual, such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and John Brown stand out as a few of the subjects in his monograph. As an early source in Hayden's thinking and writing, the short monograph of 85 pages is totally untapped and unappreciated. Because of the nature of the Federal Writers Project and publication, its authenticity needs to be further established by a study of the papers of the director of the WPA in Detroit, who attributed it to Hayden, and then documented, and eventually it needs to be published. I believe it sheds a great deal of light upon Hayden's later career in poetry and should be taken into account by anyone writing serious scholarship on Hayden. The University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library in Ann Arbor has a copy of it, while it appears the copy that used to be at the Detroit Public Library has been misplaced or lost somehow. A decade after first writing about Frederick Douglass and the history of the Negro in Michigan, Hayden published his resonant grand old sonnet, Frederick Douglass, in the Atlantic Monthly in 1947. Frederick Douglass, when it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally won, when it is more than a gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of a beautiful, needful thing. Wow. It's really a powerful poem. It's one of Hayden's poems that that has always appealed to me. Even before I had ever met him in 1979, I had been reading his poems for some time, and it's really one of the most dramatic and powerful sonnets, I think, that anybody ever wrote in the 20th century. A few years earlier, I had read it in a theater class, an interpretative reading of poetry, prior to meeting Hayden. I've often thought of it as the decades have gone by, and the line with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing. It's a visionary poem, full of hope and human possibility. I've often thought about this poem throughout my life. About a decade ago, I attended a performance of Romeo and Juliet at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Canada, which I've never been able to forget, in which Juliet was a beautiful young black woman and an outstanding actress, while all the families and character groups, the Shakespearean doubling and balancing of characters, were cast as interracial couples, the Montagues and the Capulets and so forth. Race was totally incidental, if not irrelevant, to the production. The actors were naturally who they were in the role, and everything was lifted to an astonishingly beautiful realm of art and humanity. By chance, last week in a restaurant, while waiting in line to order, my wife and I noticed a beautiful little baby of 4 or 5 months being held by her father, looking over his shoulder at us in fascination as babies will, smiling. It's good for all of us, despite failings and shortcomings. We have entered a realm in which the word interracial is dated and absurd.
Yes.
And while emphasizing not everyone should want to intermarry, as the phrase has it, Hayden would often joke that the only way we're ever, quote unquote, the only way we're ever going to get past all of this obscene race business is in the bedroom. End quote. As the son of a black father and Irish mother, Hayden went through it all and struggled with it all his life, from both black and white people. I think Robert Hayden would be thrilled at how much progress we have made, and yet probably unsurprised at how far we still have to go toward the beautiful, needful thing.
Yes.
Fortunately, we have his poetry to help us get there, point the way. In his 2-page biographical sketch of Sojourner Truth in the History of the Negro again, Hayden writes a short but suggestive account of her life and ordeals from the time of her enslavement to becoming what he calls, quote, one of the greatest women America has ever produced, unquote. Her 5 children, just think of that a moment, her 5 children having been sold off to other masters, she fled slavery in 1826, eventually settling in Battle Creek, Michigan. And during the Civil War, as Hayden phrases it in that work, traveled all over the North, end quote, on behalf of the abolitionist movement to free her people, meeting famously with Abraham Lincoln eventually in 1865. More than 35 years after writing his sketch of her, Hayden wrote a poem about her in his sequence of poems titled Stars. Another fine example of how, with a theme, once it appealed to his imagination, he just never let go of it and kept working it until he worked it into a poem. Sojourner Truth comes walking barefoot out of slavery. Ancestress, childless mother, following the stars, her mind a star. One of the great facts of her life that Hayden had recorded in his sketch was that Lincoln received anti-Sojourner with warm cordiality and showed her a beautiful Bible which the Negroes of Baltimore had given him as a token of their gratitude for emancipation. And that really becomes a photograph, an engraving that's very famous at the time and shared all over the United States, and by people of all backgrounds even, too. In Hayden's sketch of the meeting of John Brown and Frederick Douglass in Detroit in 1859, he points out that Douglass was opposed to Brown's plan for Harper's Ferry, writing, quote, Douglass was among those who believed that Harper's Ferry raid would bring only tragedy. He questioned the wisdom of the proposed insurrection, end quote. More than 35 years later, when Hayden writes his sequence of poems about John Brown, commissioned by the Founders Society of the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1978, to accompany a joint portfolio and catalog and exhibition of screen prints by the outstanding African-American artist Jacob Lawrence, who's really just an astonishingly wonderful artist. Hayden remains still ambivalent about John Brown, torn and conflicted about the nature of John Brown's motivation and actions and the ironies and tragedies of history. I'll read John Brown from the DIA catalog, which has a picture of Hayden sitting at his desk, working on the poem, and if anyone would like to look at it later, I'll have it here for you if you'd like. John Brown, loved, feared, hated, aureoled in violence, foredoomed to fail in all but the prophetic task. Acts in Jehovah's loving, wrathful hand. The face is not cruel, the eyes are not mad, but unsparing. The life has the symmetry of a cross. John Brown, Osawatomi, healed man. 2, this is a series of 5 poems. 2, doing the Lord's work with saber sharpened on the grindstone of the word. Bleeding Kansas. The cries of my people, the cries of their oppressors, harrowed, hacked, poisoned meat for Satan's maw. I slew no man, but blessed the chosen, who in the name of justice killed at my command. Bleeding Kansas. The son martyred there, I am tested, I am true, made worthy of my servitude. Oh, the crimes of this guilty, guilty land. Let Kansas bleed. 3, fury of truth, fury of righteousness become angelic evil, demonic good. My hands are bloody, who never wished to kill, wished only to obey the higher law. Fury of truth, its enigmas, its blinding illuminations. 4, fire harvest, John Brown and his chosen at Harper's Ferry. Fury of the word made pikes, guns, swords. Arm the slaves, seize their masters, kill only if you must. Blood burst, blood flow. Who sent you here, John Brown? None in human form. Fire harvest, spent, forlorn, colossal in that bloody light, death agonies around him, Gabriel and Nat awaiting him. I have failed. Come, death, breathe life into my cause, O death. Last poem, 5. And now, these mordant images, these vibrant stained glass colors, elemental shapes and ardent interplay with what we know of him, know yet fail to understand. Even we, for whom he died, shall we not say he died for us? Hanged body turning clockwise in the air, the hour speeding to that hour, his dead of night sorrows, visions prophesied. And now, these haunting, stark, torch-like images. Such beautiful description, too, of Jacob Lawrence's art. It's really astonishing. And let me say, too, as an aside, the Art Institute had published 60 very large folios of the screen prints by Jacob Lawrence, and then Hayden's poem, similar to the smaller catalog, at the back of the volume. And they only published 60 copies of it, and it must be really valuable after all this time, too. wherever they've gone to, who owns them. Hayden's rhetorical questions about Brown ironically present him as a questionable hero driven by religious zeal, if not delusion, doing the Lord's work with savor, fury of truth, becoming angelic evil, demonic good. Hayden plays on the double meaning of the word mordant, meaning caustic or sarcastic, and at the same time a process of dyeing and painting used to fix colors to paper. Jacob Lawrence's beautiful style of gouaches evoke a strikingly dramatic artistic conception and sophisticated folk flavor. Together, both artists created a major portfolio musing on the life and legacy of John Brown. No simple answer ever, but what Hayden called in another poem, the struggle to be human toward, quote, man permitted to be man. Late in life, he wrote through his alien persona in the poem American Journal about an alien disguising himself, he himself, Hayden, behind the mask of the poem, as it were. Quoting from the poem, in order to study them unobserved, adapting their varied pigmentations, white, black, red, brown, yellow, the imprecise and strangering distinctions by which they live, by which they justify their cruelties to one another. Going on to write of human beings, quote, not yet more than raw, crude neophytes, like earthlings everywhere. In his collected prose, which I also edited for the University of Michigan Press, Hayden suggests much of all of this in a biographical piece he wrote while consulted in poetry at the Library of Congress in 1978, and which is worth thinking about. Quote, there is a great deal of talk today, much of it generating more heat than light, about black identity. Our poet, talking about himself, writing about himself in the third person, our poet, now something of an old curmudgeon, is likely to be heard protesting that he doesn't understand what all the fuss is about. I always knew who and what I was, he has said. Remember, I grew up in the ghetto, which, if mixed in those days, was predominantly Afro-American. I never had any trouble relating to the people around me. There was, of course, color prejudice among us, the dark skin with bad, or what we call today natural hair, and the fair skin or the light brown with good hair. My own family exhibited several shades and gradations of pigmentation, but I never thought of the people I knew as being anything but human. My playmates were, for a time, Italian, Jewish, even Southern white, for the old neighborhood had in the first years of the century been settled by people of several different ethnic backgrounds. I ate halva and smoked fish in the homes of Jewish kids. I went to school with Italians and Greeks and Poles. At the age of 12 or 13, I even knew a few words of Chinese because Cooney, the son of the owner of the Chinese restaurant where my aunt worked for so many years off and on, and I were friends and went to the Detroit Musical Arts Institute together for violin lessons. As far as the members of my own race were concerned, I loved or disliked them purely on the basis of their pleasing or displeasing actions and personalities. End quote from his autobiography, short piece. This passage always makes me think, too, of the Detroit poet, editor, and publisher Dudley Randall, who said once in an interview late in life with Professor Melba Boyd of Queen State University, she interviewed him, that his parents had always taught him that there were good and bad people in all races. Naomi Madgett, whom I had the pleasure of hearing read once, way back in the 1970s at Eastern Michigan University, where I was a student for a few years before transferring to the University of Michigan, recently said in a PBS program aired during this winter of African American poets, the program, said similarly moderate and realistic views. And as I mentioned in my centennial address on Robert Hayden at Wayne State in April of 2013, earlier that year, when I was leaving a United Nations Association meeting at the Detroit Public Library, walking out the back entrance, I saw again the large empty area of grass that's in the center of this back Circle Drive. A lot of us here know about it, know it's there, been there many times. And the idea came to me that a bronze statue of Robert Hayden ought to be there.
Yeah.
And Robert Hayden on that spot would be a most suitable honor for him as the worthy son of both Detroit Public Library,
Yes.
great library, and the adjacent university where he went to. And facing the university where he went from that library, he tells the story in his prose that there was a librarian at the Detroit Public Library who would put aside books of poetry for him so he could read them as a young kid, because they were poor and had no money for such fancy stuff, or whatever. And so it had a tremendous impact on his life, as well as his social worker had helped him get into City College at that time. And he tells a story that the social worker, he asked the social worker during one interview of whatever routine, asked him, "What do you want to do with your kid life, young man?" He said, "Well, I'm hoping I go to college or something." And he was probably shocked and said, "You're going to college, if I got anything to do it." And he helped him get in. He really did. Changed the whole course of his life, of course. Now, throughout history, civilizations around the world have often found it beneficial, when striving to set a new course for their societies, to dedicate a public work of art to a man or woman who embodies the values that can help it move forward in the right direction. Hayden is the most important poet that the state of Michigan has ever produced. I really believe it.
Yes.
And I can't understand why he isn't known more, and taught absolutely every classroom, English classroom in the state. I really believe it. And I believe Robert Hayden's life and art embrace the powerful psychic energy that can indeed help Detroit and the whole nation heal more and go forward in the right direction. As long as I live, I shall continue to canvass the powers that be to take up the idea and make it a reality, though a Hayden statue anywhere in the city of Detroit would be just fine with me. In closing, let me say, Detroit Public Library has copies of Hayden's books and of mine that I mentioned. If you'd like to read further, I also have a few copies of my own books here, and copies to look at of Hayden's collected poems and prose. Source Booksellers, which is on Cass Avenue, just a couple blocks south of Warren, has copies of my epic poem, The Parliament of Poets, in which Robert Hayden's a character, and plays various key roles in my own writing. And I want to thank you again for coming this evening, and hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure and honor to be here at the Wright Museum.
Responding to what Kearns was responding to when he made those comments about the universality of the.
Well, he had, he taught at Fisk University, and he went through various situations and struggles with poetry and how it was understood in the 60s. And and even coming to University of Michigan too, he at times met with people who felt that poetry should be completely politicized, all about the social struggle, and to his mind didn't embrace enough the notion of poetry as a universal art that dealt with human things that were beyond the political realm, really, moral, spiritual, whatever he conceived of it. So his collected prose, he talks about this a lot, because throughout the prose there are different situations that arise, and then he's writing a piece about it or whatever. So that would be the place to go if you're interested in exploring that more in terms of his life.
So as a person who, I know I have read poems from him before, some of the things I heard you read sounded familiar to me from perhaps years ago in elementary or high school or at some point, reading from an anthology like you mentioned. For someone who's really keen to learn more and expose others, here at the museum, we always have opportunities to talk about poetry every April, as you mentioned, Poetry Month. But we want to, there are ways that we can perhaps infuse other programs or other activities or other events, or just ways to just expose youth to this person.
Yeah.
What ways would you, what books, what poems?
Well, primarily I'd recommend the collected poems. There have been 3 editions of the collected poems from the first one that I edited in the 1980s, 90s, and now just in 2013 as a centennial edition. It's a paperback edition, so the hope is especially affordable for young people and students. And that would be a good one to maybe consider adding to the bookstore or something around here. Hayden wrote only about 200 pages of poetry, which is a relatively small amount of poems, but it's the exquisite quality. He set a very high standard for himself, and if it didn't meet that standard, he didn't include it. And so that's why I and many people serious about poetry consider Hayden a major poet, even though maybe somebody else wrote 30 or 70 books, 30 or 70 books that are kind of a little mediocre, sloppy, or whatever, you know, is different from something that's just like some of the things they've written are just beautiful and profound about every dimension of life.
Yeah.
He wrote about with him. Yeah, and then if a young person is interested more, definitely read the prose. The prose is available online through University of Michigan and elsewhere. It's also an e-book. Actually, the collected poetry is an e-book too, I should mention. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.